Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started right on time. The participants are coming in quickly, so, and welcome everybody to tonight's discussion with Dr. Rita Colwell about her recent autobiography, A Lab of One's Own, One's Personal Journey Through Sexism in Science. I'm Dorothy Teagarden. I'm the director of the Purdue Women's Global Health Institute, and our institute serves as a nexus of interdisciplinary research to create partnerships, promote research, and develop training opportunities to improve the health of women globally. And our focus is on research on prevention and early detection. But thank you all for joining us tonight. We're really excited. We have over 400 registrants from really around the world for tonight's meeting. And we're also really excited to welcome our co-sponsors for this event. The Division of Diversity and Inclusion from the Office of the Provost, the College of Health and Human Sciences, the Purdue Institute of Inflammation, Immunology, and Infectious Disease, or PI4D, the Purdue Policy Research Institute, the Women in Engineering Program, the Women in Science Program, and Advanced Purdue and the Center for Faculty Success, and the Women's Genders and Sexuality Studies Program. Thank you all for helping us with this event. You know, for me, this book by Dr. Colwell is not only her own story in science and her truly exceptional research, but stories of many women in science, and their stories and her and their efforts, for me, was just truly inspirational. We're really privileged to have Dr. Colwell with us. If you have any questions for Dr. Colwell, please enter them in the Q&A box, and we'll cover as many as possible at the end of the discussion. Next, I'm really pleased to introduce the interviewer for tonight's discussion, Dr. Rosie Clausen, Dr. Clausen is a professor of political science at Purdue. She was previously the head of the Department of Political Sciences, as well as the interim director of the Purdue Policy Research Institute, and particularly pertinent to tonight's discussion. She's also the Director of Diversity and Culture of Inclusion for the Aspire Engineering and Research Center. Her own research focuses on American politics, especially public opinion, mass media, and importantly includes the politics of race, class, and gender. So thank you, Dr. Clausen, for agreeing to serve as the interview for tonight's event with Dr. Colwell. We're really happy to have you with us. And next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Teresa Mayer, the Purdue's Executive Vice President for Research and Partnerships, who will introduce Dr. Colwell for us. Dr. Mayer.
Yeah, thank you, Dorothy. And once again, thank you to all the sponsors of this wonderful event tonight. Dr. Colwell, it was a real pleasure to hear your commencement address not that long ago, just before the pandemic. And I just want to say how pleased we are that you're able to join us this evening and really, again, share your experience with a large audience from across the world. So I would like to give a brief introduction of Dr. Colwell, who, as all of you know, holds many distinguished honors. So I will try to be brief, which is challenging. First, Dr. Rita Colwell is a distinguished university professor, both at the University of Maryland at College Park and at Johns Hopkins University, Bloomberg School of Public Health. She's a senior advisor and chairman emeritus at Canon U.S. Life Sciences and the president and chairman of Cosmos ID International. Her interests over the years are focused on global infectious diseases, water and health, and she is currently developing an international network to address emerging infectious diseases and water issues, including safe drinking water for both the developed and developing world in collaboration with the Safe Water Network that's headquartered in New York City. Dr. Colwell served as the 11th director of the National Science Foundation from 1998 to 2004. While she was NSF director, she served as the co-chair of the Committee on Science of the National Science and Technology Council. Throughout her time, her major interests included K-12 science and mathematics education, graduate science and engineering education, and the increased participation of women and minorities in science and engineering. Before joining NSF, she was the president of the University of Maryland Biotechnology Institute and the professor of microbiology and biotechnology at the University of Maryland. She was also a member of the National Science Board from 1984 to 1990. Over the years, Dr. Colwell has held many advisory positions in the US government, nonprofit science policy organizations, and private foundations, as well as the international scientific research community. She has authored and co-authored many books and even more scientific publications. And notably, she produced the award-winning film Invisible Seas and has served on many editorial boards of scientific journals. She's been awarded 55 honorary degrees from many institutions of higher education, including her alma mater, Purdue University. And she is the recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun, Gold and Silver Star bestowed by the Emperor of Japan, as well as the 2006 National Medal of Science and the 2010 Stockholm Water Prize awarded by the King of Sweden. A geological site in Antarctica, the Colwell Massif, has been named in recognition of her work in the polar regions. She holds a BS in bacteriology and an MS in genetics from Purdue University and a PhD in oceanography from the University of Washington. She has truly changed the world through her research to understand cholera and help people have clean water, saving lives. And very pertinent to the conversation tonight, throughout her career, she's been working in a male-dominated field. She has helped women not only stay in science field, but very importantly, to succeed in science and engineering fields. As the director of NSF, she developed and implemented the advanced program to create institutional transformation at universities so that women STEM faculty could survive and thrive. NSF has invested over $270 million to support advanced projects at more than 100 institutions and STEM-related nonprofit organizations. This year, Advance is celebrating its 20th year, and I can say that Advance has touched me in many different ways as a faculty member throughout my career, as a junior faculty member at Penn State, and then serving as mentors at Virginia Tech, as well as several universities in New York City. And I think it has had a tremendous impact on women's success and advancement. Purdue did receive an Advance award and has established the Advanced Purdue Center for Faculty Success. It's now being sustained through the Office of the Provost. So importantly, these awards have led to sustained efforts at the universities they have touched, and that is a true measure of the impact and the success. We have focused on increasing the number of women of color in STEM tenure track faculty positions, improving the success of all female STEM tenure track faculty, engaging all faculty in transforming the institution, and to foster a more diverse workplace where all faculty flourish. Dr. Colwell has also been serving on the External Advisory Council for the Women's Global Health Institute since 2012, and we have benefited tremendously from your leadership and your guidance throughout that time. So once again, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today, and I very much look forward to the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to the discussion and the questions from the audience as well.
Good evening. It's an honor to get to interview you this evening, Dr. Colwell. I want to encourage our audience to go ahead and put questions in the Q&A as we go along, and we will get to them a little later in the program. First, I want to start by just saying how wonderful your book is. When Dorothy emailed me back in January and asked me to conduct this interview, she provided a little abstract of the book, and I read the abstract and I thought, you know, I'm on fellowship this semester. I've really been saying no to all these service duties, but this abstract looks so good, I'm gonna do it. So I told Dorothy yes. I asked her to send me the book. So a couple of days later, I get the book and I pick it up and I think, well, I'm just gonna read the blurbs on the back. I'm gonna maybe look at the table of contents, maybe look at the intro. I wasn't intending to read it, you know, because I knew at that point, okay, it's January, I still have to April to read it. And I started reading it and I literally stayed up half the night to finish it. So to the audience, that is how good the book is. It is engrossing. And, you know, I'm going to give you a sales pitch here. Go out and get the book. And I hope that the questions I asked tonight will give you a flavor of what is in the book. So Dr. Colwell, let me dive in by asking you about your connection to Purdue. How did you end up at Purdue as an undergraduate? And then what path did that set you on?
Well, it was a very zigzaggy path because I had applied to, being a young person in Beverly Cove, Massachusetts, I applied to the women's colleges because at the time, girls couldn't go to Harvard. They couldn't go to Yale or Princeton. So I applied to Smith and Wellesley and was accepted, but and to Radcliffe. And Radcliffe intrigued me, but women couldn't even use the library at Harvard. And I also would have had to commute because I didn't have very much money. And I would have had to work at home and take the train in every day on the Boston and Maine, which we used to call the broken and mended, because that was particularly how it was in terms of maintenance. And my sister had recently married a physicist. She was an art student, and she had taken a position teaching art at Purdue, and she married a physicist who was on Fulbright. And she suggested, why don't you apply to Purdue? So I did, and I received a wonderful scholarship that paid for the tuition and for the books, and I decided that's what I shall do. And I've never turned back. I think that was the best decision in my life, because had I gone to Radcliffe, I probably would have been trained into a program that was appropriate for women at the time, when I was really interested in science, and the opportunity to do science at Radcliffe would have been quite limited for women. So that's how I came to arrive at Purdue. And I arrived at Purdue just at a time when it was expanding. It had received the equivalent of $500 million for expanding the buildings and to develop the engineering and so forth. So I came just at the right time.
Sounds like it. You talk frankly in your book about the obstacles you ran into in your education, but also how those obstacles gave you special gifts and strengths, such as the ability to do interdisciplinary work. So can you tell us a little bit about some of those obstacles and how they shaped your later achievements?
Yes, there were obstacles, and I think in overcoming them, I became a stronger person. For example, I had decided that I would go to medical school. This was influenced by my very best friend, even today, who was a roommate at Purdue. And I was very interested in medicine and decided that that's what I would do. So it turned out that in the spring semester in March of that year, of my graduation year, I happened to go out on a blind date with a very handsome graduate student. And quite honestly, we decided to get married 2 months later, which turned into a very, very happy 62 years of wonderful life. I miss him terribly. He passed away 3 years ago. So I went to my department chairman, since Jack had just come back from serving in the military. He had been overseas and he'd come back to Purdue and had put in a year of graduate study. We didn't want him to lose that year. It seemed very logical that I would do a master's, he'd do a master's, and then we would go on elsewhere for a PhD. Since it's good not to do your bachelor's, master's, and PhD in one institution, or at least that was what we were advised. So I thought, well, I'll just go to the department chairman because I knew there were some fellowships that I could get a fellowship and stay and do a master's in microbiology. So I went to the department chairman and told him my story. And his reaction was, we don't waste fellowships on women. You'll just go off and get married, and the only degree you're going to get is in the maternity ward of a hospital. Well, I don't think anyone would say that. Well, if they did, they wouldn't have much sense today. But my reaction was to be really nonplussed. So I went to my undergraduate advisor, who was terrific. In those days, I don't know how it is now, but in those days, you could not register without first seeing your advisor, who would go over your coursework and then sign off, and then you could go register. So he knew my grades, he knew me pretty well. So I went to see Dr. Burdick. He was known as Tex Burdick, but we students called him Dr. Burdick. And I told him my sad story. And his reaction was, well, I think their loss is going to be my gain because I just happen to have a graduate research fellowship. And if you're willing to take care of the fruit flies, feed them every week, you're welcome to do a master's in genetics. That turned out to be the best thing that could have happened because it was just not too many years after the publication of the Watson-Crick description of the alpha helix of the DNA molecule. And it was a time when genetics was exploding. So at Purdue at the time, they were very serious about the master's in genetics. I had to take fruit fly genetics, of course, but also tomato genetics and chicken genetics and microbial genetics and human genetics. It was terrific. I mean, I was absolutely immersed in genetics at a time when it was just exploding. So that's, I think, the best example of having overcome an obstacle that turned out to be a benefit.
Thank you for that story. You mentioned that you were often praised as a science administrator, but not always as a scientist. Why do you think that was the case, and what impact did that have on your career and the advice you would give women scholars today?
So it was distressing in the sense that whatever work that I had done as a scientist, it was always in the context of a woman scientist. In other words, I was never really accepted as a scientist. I was just kind of this odd creature woman who was doing science, and whatever was done couldn't possibly be significant. And this is, it's demoralizing, to put it, I think, in the strongest word possible, because it makes you keep questioning yourself as to whether you're really a scientist. So I think that coupled with the constant slurs, the fact that when you're in class in those days, very likely if you raised your hand, you wouldn't be called on. Or if you turned in an exceptionally good paper, you would get this kind of superficial praise in the sense that almost as if you were a puppy dog had learned a new trick or something. So it was very depressing, but my reaction was to get really strong-minded, angry, and just to kind of show them that women could do science. And therefore, I worked harder, published more papers. By the way, publication, when you are in a position where you're having a hard time proving yourself, by, by being able to describe your research in packets instead of waiting until the perfect, complete paper is done, is important because you build an audience. And in fact, your audience often doesn't even know whether you're male or female, particularly if you just use your initials. So you can build a reputation despite the fact that, that you are a woman fighting in a man's world.
And I think your interdisciplinary background allows you to do a good job of communicating to lots of different audiences. So that training and knowing that you need to communicate to different disciplines, I think is really useful. And that might be a good tip for women scholars today too.
Well, in a way, I think I was sort of very far ahead of what is happening, because the fact that I ended up doing genetics, and then I was accepted at medical school. I had been accepted at Yale. My husband was accepted in a graduate program at the University of Washington. They had a medical school. I applied. I was accepted, but then I got a second letter that said that we don't accept anyone in the medical school who has not lived at least a year or is a resident of the Pacific Northwest, meaning Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, or British Columbia. So I was offered an alternative to the microbiology department, which I accepted. And I ended up really in marine microbiology by another series of strange events. But it turns out that at that time, there were about 10 marine microbiologists in the entire world, if that number. And it was not really a hot area to be in. But the field has caught up with me, because now marine microbiology and evolutionary microbiology is the hottest thing going. So I received a fabulous education in systematics, and while at the University of Washington, had the opportunity to use a computer which had just arrived at the university. It was this clunky machine put in the attic of the chemistry building because it was the only place they could air condition for the computer. The rest of the building didn't matter. You just had to sort of sweat through it in the summer. But graduate students were allowed to use the computer only between midnight and 6 a.m. And you had to program it yourself. You had to go up and plug it, and wire it every time you used it, plus the IBM cards. If you dropped them, you had to calculate it all over again. But that was the beginning of computer science. And I was at the very beginning of it, and writing a program in machine language. So these steps along the way turned into tremendous advantages.
I love the story in your book where you talk about turning in your dissertation and that your committee wasn't really that familiar with the computer. And so you taped the IBM cards on page 41 of your dissertation so that your committee members could see what you were talking about.
That's a fact. And I'm sure that I breezed through my PhD exam for the very reason they weren't sure what questions to ask.
You also mentioned that you knew, this was like, I believe 1961 you said, and that you knew you could see how computers were going to revolutionize the sciences. How did you know?
That came about because what I had done as a PhD thesis, what I had written was a description of marine bacteria. This was a time pre-sequencing. It was a time when taxonomy was fustian and obsolete, so to speak, in the sense that taxonomists argued over names and whether phenotype or genotype was important. And I had studied so many bacteria from different marine animals that it was impossible really to kind of map it all out without reams of paper. And so putting it all onto a computer and getting a matchup was terrific. And one of the experiments that I did, which is now considered a major experiment in terms of microbial evolution, was to take a microorganism, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and to put it into 10 different media and to transfer it over and over and over again in the specific medium so that we could force mutations or adaptations or selection. And that gave me such a huge amount of data that the only way to interpret it was to run it through a computer. And so it was clear to me that if I, as a little microbiologist in one corner of the world, needed a computer to analyze my data, certainly the rest of the world is going to need some pretty big computers to analyze all those data.
That history is so interesting. I'm going to read a quote from your book. "Some may think my approach was milquetoast, but I've always believed that if you want to get things done, you don't poke sticks in people's eyes." So I want you to tell us a little bit more about that approach, but I'm also curious about whether you ever got so fed up that you did have to poke a few sticks in somebody's eye.
I never did that publicly, I'll tell you that. But privately, I suppose I might have made an acerbic comment. My point is that it's important to get done what needs to be done, what needs to be accomplished. And if you can go through it without demanding immediate recognition, but you get the job done, in the end, that's more important. And ultimately, the recognition comes in a very pleasant, sometimes private, but a very pleasant way. For example, in running a meeting, when I was academic vice president and provost of the University of Maryland system, I sat in with the rest of the presidents and officers, and I learned very early on that when I made a comment, suggestion, there would be a kind of a pause, and then the discussion would proceed, and then a male would make the same thing, make the same statement or suggestion, and everybody would say, you know, that's a great idea. So I learned how to seed the ideas, and when I got to the point that I was chairing meetings, I made sure everybody had something to say, everybody around the table, and that I would seed ideas that would get picked up by the men. And then I would summarize at the end that I've heard all these great suggestions, and let's have a motion and move forward. And it would work very nicely. So we would accomplish everything I wanted, but I didn't have to pound the table or you know, make the comment that, look, you're not listening to me. It didn't matter. It was important to get things done. And I could accomplish a great deal too, because I found too often meetings I attended, chairmen, men, who we'd come to a decision and then they'd start discussing it all over again. And then we'd come to a second decision and that would drive me crazy. So I learned how to manage meetings so that we could get it done on time and get done what we all could agree on. So that's part of the wile and the how shall I say, the surreptitious way of getting done what needs to get done.
Yeah, I think all the women in the audience are probably nodding their heads and feeling that your story is very familiar to them. So I appreciate it. You have a fascinating chapter in your book dedicated to the anthrax letters. Please tell our audience about that experience and the lessons you and others learned along the way.
That was a fascinating period in my life, and in fact, all of those who worked with me, because that chapter was reviewed by everybody who participated in the work we did, and it was actually approved for release by the CIA. So it's a legitimate chapter that tells a story that has never been told before in the detail that it's told in the book. How that came about was that I was director of the National Science Foundation. I was meeting on the day of 9/11 event in New York City with staff from the White House. We were discussing the NSF budget that was coming up for release from the White House to go to Congress. When there was a knock at the door, it was like 8:30 in the morning. And it was my assistant who came in and said, there's been a terrible tragedy in New York. So I flipped on the TV, which the NSF director has in the office, and we flipped it on just in time to see the second plane go into the towers. It was devastating. And the staffers from the White House, from the president's staff, tried to get in touch with their, in one instance, there was a wife, and the other staffer, it was his fiance. And we heard there was another plane coming in from over Pennsylvania toward the White House or the Capitol, but they said the White House. We couldn't get any response until about 11 that morning. So I had to take several actions, one of which was to let my staff, because this, at the time, there were 1,500 employees in a 12-story building. And so I asked my deputy, where's the general public address system? Turns out it was in the basement. We trotted down to the basement and it was locked. And the keys were held by the fire chief in Arlington, Virginia, but he was pretty busy at that time at the Pentagon putting out a terrible disaster there, fire. So I said, well, the only thing we can do is break down the door. So we kicked the door in, and then I got the intercom system and announced to the staff that they could leave if they wished, but from what I could see from the 12th floor, the streets were clogged, and so if they wanted to stay until they got further information. But then 2 or 3 months later, we've gone through all that trauma, and then suddenly there's an announcement that a reporter in Florida has been hospitalized with what appears to be anthrax. Now, the first reaction, because I had been on an advisory committee on biothreats with the CIA as an advisor, the first reaction was that this was just part of the 9/11 attacks that had occurred in New York, and this was a terrorist from overseas that had done something to this reporter. But there was this strange announcement by the White House, the Homeland Security Secretary went on to say, well, it was something that the reporter must have gotten from drinking water while hiking on his way back from a visit and coming back to Florida. But my reaction was, I don't think so. And then, of course, there were cases in the Anacostia postage station, the post office. And that was, as it turned out later, that the pressure of the stamping machines that as the envelopes went through forced the pores of the envelope to release the powders that were in it. Hence, unfortunately, several people died from anthrax, and some recovered, but it's not something you get over easily. My reaction was, this is not good. We've got to sequence the bacterium that had infected and killed the reporter, because by this time, the reporter in Florida was dead. And these other cases were occurring. I called Tony Fauci as director of NSF and said, Tony, we really got to sequence that bacterium. Now, that sounds like an easy thing to do, to say it today. But we're talking about 21 years ago, when the only sequence we had was of 2 very tiny marine bacteria and half the sequence of anthrax, which turned out to be not even the right strain that was used in this event. And Tony's reaction was, of course, we need to. And he said, I'll call a meeting. But he was up to his eyes with all of the things going on, just as he is today. But for that, what was going on at that time. And after a month or so, he did call a meeting in his office. We did agree that we should reestablish a sequencing advisory committee that had, for some reason, had been disbanded. And so that was going to be started. But then there was still more time. And finally, I called Tony again. I said, Tony, look, I'll run this thing. And he said, fine, do it. And he delegated Dr. Maria Giovanni, his deputy, to be the representative for him to this meeting that I then organized with representatives from every agency. And I chaired it. And then I asked that the representatives would not be the heads of agency because they knew nothing about sequencing, but those from the agency like Department of Energy, Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture, the NIH, NSF, many of the other smaller agencies as well. Those who had been participating in the sequencing advisory committee could now be brought together, and they also had to have access to budgets and to be sufficiently high up in the agency that they could make decisions and would have the responsibility of the secretary or the head of the agency. So this group met every Friday afternoon from 1 to 2. It always had to be 1 hour because after 2 o'clock, if the FBI, and the FBI and the CIA representatives were also there at the meeting, they, if they left after 2 o'clock, they wouldn't get back to the lab in Virginia until about 5 or 7 or 8 o'clock at night. But if they left promptly at 2, they would be home by 4. So we met from 1 to 2. We were very efficient. We met in a SCIF, which is a secret compartmented room where you can do classified work. And it turned out to be fortuitous in that in one of the 2 buildings that NSF occupied, there was a private company with a SCIF, which we were able to use. And so we met every Friday afternoon, and our charge was to track down the perpetrator, to assist the FBI and the CIA using the advanced technology of sequencing, which had never been done before. And so first we started by simply agreeing to sequence all of the major threats. So the way that the table of dangerous pathogens for sequencing was established was that I put up an easel and a flipboard and said, okay, when we're in the SCIF, all right, guys, what's the most dangerous? Smallpox, anthrax, etc., down to, we included the B list, that was the A list. The B list were the economically significant pathogens like hoof and mouth disease agent, because if that had been spread, it would wipe out the dairy industry and the cattle industry and the agricultural threats. And then the third category were the kinds of pathogens like Salmonella and Shigella that could be distributed, as was done in Oregon, to supermarket lunch tables and create epidemics. So we worked on getting the sequencing done. We thought at first that this was a terrorist action from someone from overseas. But as we got the sequencing done, it turned out that it matched the Ames strain, which was used as a biothreat agent. And we were able to detect 8 mutations that the Institute for Genomic Research, Craig Venter, Claire Fraser, and the head of the lab turned out to be my former student, Jacques Ravel, and team, including Mihai Pop and a wonderful team that I've named in the chapter. They were able to determine these mutations, which were quite characteristic because the anthrax is a pretty stable bacterium because of its soil natural habitat. And we were able to track it to a strain at the Fort Detrick, which had all of the mutations. We'll never know the details because the supposed perpetrator, or the one we feel strongly was the perpetrator, committed suicide the day he was to be arrested. But it was an amazing time to work together. Half the people were women. That didn't matter. I mean, I don't remember a single comment about were there too many women or not enough women, or it was just a team. We were focused on serving our country, determining the perpetrator, the source of this, and to prevent any future use of this agent as a weapon. It was an amazing period of time.
Are there lessons that you learned during that process that should inform our current predicament and how the federal government has responded and is responding to COVID?
This was an interagency group. We were never official. We could have had a presidential directive. We could have been blessed with an official status. But if we had, then we would have had to keep minutes, and we would have had to been susceptible to Freedom of Information Act. And the CIA and the FBI would be gone because they had a criminal case to solve. And therefore, we worked as, we called ourselves the National Interagency Genomic Sciences Coordinating Committee, NSIC. And we simply worked together. And the lesson was that here were all of these government agencies working together without any consideration or worry about whether one agency was doing more than the other or getting more credit or what. We just were focused on solving the problem, and we were there to get the job done. And we worked really hard to do that. And we provided the advice, the guidance, the counsel to the FBI and the CIA that helped them solve a major crime. So I think there's a lesson, first of all, for interdisciplinarity, and second, for interagency cooperation.
Yes. Let me move now to the advanced program. In my mind, that's one of your most important legacies, is the creation of the National Science Foundation's advanced program. Can you tell us about your vision for that program, how it was created, and its impact on our society?
The impact has been significant and exciting. When I went to the National Science Foundation, I was very familiar with the NSF because I had served on many advisory committees, and well, I started out reviewing proposals. I get lots of proposals sent to me, and I would review them. Then I was invited to panels, and then I was invited to become members of advisory committees, and I chaired advisory committees. Then I was even asked to become an AD, an assistant director for the Education and Human Resources, but I was too much involved in research, so I deflected that. And so when I went to NSF, there were things I wanted to get done. Raise the graduate stipend, I knew that was too low. Provide opportunities for women, the underserved, the underrepresented in science, because we were losing so much talent, and how computers were important and how interdisciplinary science was important. For the women in science, my reaction was that, you know, having been funded by NSF prior to going to NSF for about 15 years, it made a huge difference in my career. So my notion was to have a program where you would fund women who could apply without having to be aligned with a university or a company or any organization, but simply as strong women in science, engineering, mathematics, apply to NSF and competitively be awarded a grant of $500,000 over 3 years. And the notion was, what dean or president or vice president for research is going to turn down such an individual with an NSF grant? But my deputy, Joe Bedonia, the late Joe Bedonia, wonderful, wonderful man, he and I got on really well. And the only time we really argued, and we really weren't arguing, as he put it, we were both of Italian origin, so that was our nature to argue. And he said, no, the dean has to be responsible, or the vice president for research, or the president. They have to sign off to make sure that what is promised gets done. And I said, well, Joe, you were dean at Penn and you were a great dean, but none other deans are as great as you. And so we argued, and finally we compromised. Half would go my way and half would go Joe's way. But it became very obvious that more was getting done by getting the institutional commitment at the highest level where they couldn't weasel out of it. And that was the path to take. And when we were writing the book, we did a study of my way and his way. And it turned out my way would have ended up with a few hundred new faculty, and the way that we compromised on his way, we ended up with nearly 10,000 new faculty, women, in universities around the country. So that, Joe, I thank you and always thank you for that, and I think women will. But I also am delighted that the advanced program stayed intact and continued to this day and has been extraordinarily successful because it has been an institutional program. And what it does is provide a mechanism for women to gather, discuss problems they meet up with in a group, so that there's a way to know that what is impediment is the system and not your personal feeling. That's really important.
And I want to echo what Teresa said at the beginning, that advanced program has had an impact on my career. And so, I personally thank you and really appreciate and have seen the impact that it's had across Purdue and at other institutions. I am watching the number of questions go up in the Q&A. And so I want to just thank you so much, Rita, for the opportunity to get to talk to you this evening. And I will turn it over to Dr. Didak to monitor the Q&A and ask the questions.
Thank you, Rosie. It's been wonderful.
I want to thank you both, Dr. Colwell and Dr. Clausen, so much as well. It was so interesting already so far and very inspirational, as we can see by the many questions that have already come in. I'm Rita Colwell, the Associate Director of the Purdue Women's Global Health Institute, and I will help moderate these questions now. We will try to get through as many as possible of those. We have, I think, 9 so far, or 10 already. But please feel free to continue putting your questions into the Q&A. And the first question is from Connie Weaver, who was the first director of the Women's Global Health Institute here, and she founded it. So her question is that during her leadership at the NSF, the agency accomplished some very important work with anthrax, deep water oil spill, allowing women to study marine ecosystems, encouraging women to be involved in symposia, etc. What big accomplishments do you see NSF working on now?
NSF is moving toward a systems approach to science, interdisciplinary kind of research, and I strongly endorse that. I tried to start interdisciplinary funding for interdisciplinary research 20 years ago when I was the director, but it was very difficult to get that notion as a function of the NSF to get it enacted. But the approach that's being taken now is to take advantage of the artificial intelligence, the machine learning, to move into the big data analysis, but to do it in a way that brings together other disciplines, and particularly the social and behavioral sciences. They really, really need to be incorporated with the hard sciences, because if we don't understand how people behave, we don't get done what we propose to get done without taking that into account. And so I'd like to see, and I think NSF is moving in this direction, of this kind of integration of all the sciences and to be able to move forward, I think, with the kinds of advances that'll be extraordinary in the years ahead. So, and I'm delighted that there's a bill before Congress to increase the NSF budget by about 10 billion, maybe 2 billion a year for 5 years. That's the best news I've ever heard with respect to science and engineering and mathematics.
certainly is a wonderful news for all of us, I think. The next question that we have here, and I'm going to combine it with another question. In hindsight, what type of mentorship you wish you had received when you were a junior researcher, especially for women who are in minority even today in many fields? And I'm combining this question with another one that just states, what is your best advice for young women pursuing STEM today?
Well, let me take the second question first. My advice is to get yourself a posse. Now, what do I mean by that? Don't suffer the indignities that you may have put on you. Don't suffer the sexism that you may encounter, or some of the misunderstandings that you don't understand what's going on. Get a group of friends who are in your department, but in the other departments around the campus as well, and meet for coffee on a regular basis, or lunch or dinner, or maybe the advanced program, which at some universities, I don't know if Purdue does it, actually hosts a lunch for the women faculty. And you have an opportunity to discuss what has happened to you, and you'll be surprised to find out that you are not alone. And just knowing that it's the system and not you that is empowering, and to be able to have a sounding board, I think gives you an opportunity to strengthen your will and your power to withstand any other future slights, swings, arrows of fortune, so to speak. In doing that, what was the question again? The first one.
What type of mentorship you would have wished for?
Well, I was really lucky in the mentors that I ended up with. First of all, my father believed that education was the one thing that every person must have. That was primacy for him. Whether you were a girl or a boy, you were going to go to college. And all of us 6 children did go to college. The undergraduate advisor, Tex Burdick, made it possible for me to get my master's degree. And then he told me to, when I went to the University of Washington, to look up a geneticist there. So I took his advice when I went to the University of Washington to do this 1 year in purgatory, which turned out to be a PhD instead of purgatory, because I was going to go to medical school by working that 1 year. I arrived at the university, and the advisor, the mentor that I was assigned to, was an enologist. He had graduated from the University of California, Davis, and was a microbiologist, but not the kind that I was particularly interested in at the moment. And I told him my undergraduate advisor's advice to go and talk to this other professor. Well, when I said that, he froze, and I thought, good grief, what did I say? Well, it turned out he and this other professor hated each other. So there I was, caught the first day of enrolling at the university in a faculty fight that was going over my head. But in any case, I went on to work with the geneticist, but it didn't work out. So there were only 2 women in his lab. One was a technician and the other was me. It was clear that he didn't think women mattered much as scientists, so it was best for me to move on. Fortunately, I ended up working as a technician for Dr. John Liston, who, by the way, just passed away last week, and I shall miss him terribly. He was 95. John had just arrived from Scotland to start a new program in marine microbiology. He needed a technician to get his lab put together. So I took the job. I needed the money. But after a few months, he said, you should be a graduate student. You shouldn't be a technician. So I was his first graduate student. And here was the ideal mentor. a person with great sense of humor, an extremely good scientist, very supportive of women because his wife was a botanist and she had not been able to pursue her career because of the sexism, which was even more bleak in Scotland at that time. And so he was very supportive in every way possible. And I think that was good fortune. I mean, it was sort of tripping into it, falling into it, rather than selecting it. But the characteristics are good scientist, very supportive of diversity, great sense of humor, widely read in the arts and the literature as well as in science. And it was a match that was just absolutely perfect. Plus, he was supportive when Jack and I both got postdocs from the National Research Council in Canada. Jack had found a slot there in low temperature physics, which was ideal for him. And I had applied to work with a postdoc mentor there. But unfortunately, I got another letter after the letter of acceptance and award of a fellowship saying that because of nepotism rules, husbands and wives could not both have fellowships. Of course, Jack would get the fellowship, and I agreed to that. But John Liston said, well, literally, he said, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And so he said, we'll apply for an NSF grant, which we did. The grant was awarded. He made me the PI. That was amazing. A co-PI. We were both PIs. And then he arranged for the dean to have me appointed as a research assistant professor and granted an immediate leave of absence so I could do the work at the National Research Council in Canada. That's amazing when I think about it in retrospect. That's what you call a real mentor. And we stayed friends ever after. And as I say, I kept in touch with John and his family, and John has just recently passed away.
I'm sorry to hear that, but that sounds like a fantastic mentor for anybody. And I also hear from your story that you should also notice when something is not working out and just moving on, and there will be another opportunity that often turns out even better than the first one, right? That sounds great. We have, I think, possibly a question from a student. I'm a student at Winthrop University. My freshwater ecology textbook has a section discussing your research on Vibrio cholerae in a chapter we are covering this week, coincidentally. My question is, since you were one of the earlier female scientists, did you have any female role models in your journey? And how do you feel about being a role model for so many other women after you?
Very honestly, I had very, very few role models. I had wonderful supporters. For example, when I was in high school, I thought I would want to be a chemist. And so I asked the chemistry teacher, and I was getting an A in chemistry, for a recommendation. At that time, it was to go to Radcliffe. And he said women don't do chemistry. So he would not write a letter of recommendation. So I went to one of my English teacher, who was wonderful. She was terrific. She wrote great letters for me to Smith and to Wellesley and to Radcliffe, but also to Purdue. So going to Purdue, there were only, at the time I was there were only 2 full professors, 2 or 3 in the entire university. One was Dorothy Powelson. She was wonderful, but she ended up not getting promoted, and even though she had more grant money than everybody else in the department, and left for Stanford, the Stanford Research Institute. But she is the person who really convinced me to do microbiology, because I took her course in the fall semester of my senior year, and that was when I really realized that microbiology was my love, because the way she taught it was fantastic. She assigned every one of us a really good microscope, and we could really do some very interesting experiments. And she taught in a way that was really, really, I think, impactful. And then at the University of Washington, Unfortunately, there was a woman professor, but she wasn't actually a full professor until she was awarded an NIH grant that was a career grant that paid her salary for the rest of her career, half her salary, and the university had to pay the other half. And so they promoted her from a lecturer to a full professor in one fell swoop in order to get the money, because they wouldn't have gotten her half of the salary. And they also increased her salary. So, but she was pretty strict, and wasn't the sort of person that you could go and tell your woes to, because her reaction was, suck it up, or whatever the term is, take whatever the hardship is and just get on with it. It makes you stronger. Well, sometimes that's good advice, but you also kind of need to talk things out sometimes. So I really didn't have a lot of mentors. I had a lot of very good friends, women friends who I leaned on when needed throughout my career. And my roommates from college, from Purdue, and my sorority sisters from Purdue, we still Zoom together, I'd like you to know. So the Purdue tradition holds strong. And so the four of us who roomed together at Purdue still are great friends.
That's wonderful. That rolls in one of the other questions asking about who was the single most influential person on your academic or professional journey, and why?
I think probably Dr. Tracy Miller Fishman. She went on to medical school, became a pediatric ophthalmologist, and she and her husband, Ron Fishman, also a physician, have been international physicians, kind of their own Doctors Without Borders. They do surgery, eye surgery on children in Nepal and Nigeria and other countries around the world. And Marilyn has received many awards, including leading awards from the American Medical Association.
Great, thank you. Okay, let me find here. Do you think it is important to allow men to take credit for women's ideas still today, or have we gotten past that need? Doesn't this approach undercut advancement of women in the long run? So yes, yeah. As you have told your story about, you need to get certain things done, and it's better to get them done and let other people take the credit. You get the credit later on. Is that still an advice for today?
Not for your research. No, not at all. I'm simply, my comments were with regard to administration and getting things done. And I still think it's important to get things done rather than demand credit on the spot. But if you are doing, spending 3 or 4 or 5 years doing an extensive research program, and you end up with some really good results, you really need to have the credit for it. However, I do want to point out that very often such work is teamwork, and when the research is funded by a grant that the professor has gone ahead to get funded and has been guiding the research, and if there are others that have been involved in it, then credit should be assigned in the publication appropriately. But no, I don't think the practice 20, 30, 40 years ago, where the person doing all the work got no credit, is at all ethical. Not at all ethical.
I totally concur. I have another question here about, did you ever feel like you didn't belong in your major, or the feeling of imposter syndrome, being so surrounded by men, and how did you overcome that feeling? I get that question came up when you talked about your student times at Purdue.
Well, I think, yes, I didn't so much feel imposter as being sort of where I wasn't wanted, which is not a nice feeling. To be in a group, I was almost always the only woman at meetings of the American Society for Microbiology, at the committee meetings and so forth. But what I did find irritating was even when I was director of the National Science Foundation and in Congress, sitting before the Committee on Science, the Appropriations Committee particularly, defending the NSF budget, and the chairman would ask questions of my deputy who's sitting next to me. I felt like putting my hand up and saying, by the way, I'm the director. But Joe was terrific. He would say, well, to answer your question, I think the director probably can provide a bit more information, so I'll let her speak. He was absolutely wonderful. But it didn't matter how high up you went, you still were treated as an imposter, and that was not always welcome.
Unfortunately, I still hear some stories like that today, not so much from the university, not from Purdue, but from outside. I just recently had a female student telling me she's getting the higher degree so that actually her male colleagues would listen and to her advice as well. So I am very pleased for all the questions, and I'm sorry that we will not be able to answer all of them tonight anymore. I think I'm going to wrap up here. I did want to say a big thank you again, and how inspirational your book was and is, and that actually just reading it and talking about your book together did exactly one of the things you were advising before about starting to talk to each other about stories that we might not talk to each other to. It has already done so, and we were amazed about, you know, finding out how much others have lived through similar stories and giving out each other strengths. So this is a wonderful advice from you. If you have any last advice for us women here in academia, please share that. And thank you for all the people in the audience who came with questions and for joining us tonight.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me. I have many, many friends at Purdue. Purdue gave me a really splendid education. For that, I'm very grateful. And I do think for women, I'll just make a very simple statement. Just don't let the turkeys get you down. And my last comment is, hail Purdue.
Hail Purdue. Thank you so very much, Dr. Colwell, and also Dr. Clausen again for doing the interview, and everybody else here who joined us tonight. Thank you so much. This was recorded, and you will be able to see it also on our webpage of the WGHI. I'm getting. Thank you so much again for joining us tonight.
And thank you, Dr. Clausen. It was a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to interview you and chat with you.
And you know, I enjoyed your serving the question and answer first.
Thank you so much for serving on our advisory committee. It's wonderful for being able to interact with you on a more common basis. It's great.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night.